Hey, Amy, it's good to have you on.
Good to be here.
I'm very excited to welcome two people, Amy Chang and Ashutosh Garg, that I've personally known for a very long time to FC Build and to this panel titled Power to the People. Welcome.
Thanks. Mostly power to the people named Ashu Garg, huh?
Thank you.
There's a lot of Ashu Gargness going on this call.
Hey, you should listen to our board meetings. There's three Ashus on the board.
Oh my, that's a lot of Ashu.
So 3 Indian Ashus on a Zoom call with video works, but when you do an audio only call, that makes for some fun meetings.
Well, great thought, Ashu. Yeah.
We've decided no more Ashu Gargs in that board.
Oh, good decision.
Let me introduce the two of you and then we'll dive in. Amy is a Google alum who led Google Analytics and co-founded a company, an early player in applying AI to people data that was acquired by Cisco, where she was also on the board. At Cisco, Amy led a team of 6,000 people. Wow, 6,000 people as EVP for the collaboration business. And Amy, you've also been a very, very successful board member at Cisco, Splunk, Informatica, and you're currently on the board of Procter & Gamble, Samba Nova, and Pragma. So it's really great to have you here today. And we're definitely going to have some questions for you around advice for CEOs looking for board members.
Perfect.
And my fellow Ashutosh is a fellow IIT Delhi alum who did his PhD in machine learning at Urbana-Champaign. He started his career at IBM, was an early Google research employee, and he co-founded BloomReach in 2009, which was an early player in e-commerce personalization, and then started Eightfold in 2016. Eightfold applies machine learning and AI to help enterprises acquire, develop, and retain talent. And I have the privilege of being a friend, an investor, and a board member. So thank you both for being with us here today.
Thank you.
Maybe, Amy, you and Ashu can both, since you both started your careers at Google, can talk a little bit about your career journey. What inspired you, Amy, to start a company?
Well, so funnily, Ashu and I actually knew each other at Google. So I was really excited to do this double Ashu session today because this is like a reunion here. So when I started a company, it was out of desperate need myself. On the Google Analytics side, we just started offering a premium product. And I really thought it would be much easier to do than it was. We were on 86% of the web. We thought, okay, how hard is it going to be to get like 200 enterprise clients? It cannot be that hard, right? And we're not charging as much as Core Metrics and Omniture, so of course they're going to flock to us. I had my ass handed to me in a very harsh way because enterprise sales is a whole other ball of wax, which I soon found out. And I kept thinking whenever I went into these meetings and I wasn't all the way prepared for them, my calendar is out there. How could there not be an intelligence that just goes and crawls it and understands who I'm going to meet with and then briefs me? Because everything is out there. Why is it not coming to me, right? Does every salesperson on earth not face the same problem? So that was where kind of the company idea came out of, such a painful need ourselves.
That's a great story. And Ashu, what motivated you to co-found BloomReach? And then after having done that for 8 years, you were such a glutton for punishment that you wanted to start a second company.
Some people never learn, Ashu. But first of all, thanks for setting this up. Very excited. And Amy, get to get reconnected today. So super excited about that. So I'm a machine learning data science person by training. Was at Google for a while, where I had a good fortune of leading some of the efforts in personalization, search, and recommendation space. And I saw both the impact and the value they drove to the consumers and the enterprises. And then the idea was simple, that how can we take that, scale it to pretty much every enterprise out there? Can you bring that learning that we had gathered at Google to every other company? So that is what led to start of BloomReach in 2008. At BloomReach, I was there for roughly 7.5, 8 years. And the company had its own good and bad days and my fair share of learning. But around 2015, 2016, I started thinking about what's next for me. And as I looked into various spaces, I very quickly realized that employment is my calling for 3 main reasons. One is employment, I believe, is the most fundamental thing in the society. If we can help people get the right career, we can fundamentally change the society. Second thing, at the heart of it is a data problem. As a recruiter, as a hiring manager, which is what I have been doing all my life, doing pattern matching against few people I know, few signals I have seen. How can we instead learn from the data of hundreds of millions of people across the globe? They say AI is nothing else but a massive scaler. And the third, it is an insanely large market. It is $1 trillion industry, but not much change has happened over the last 10 years. So large market, big social impact, something around my wheelhouse, made sense. Started in 2016.
That makes a ton of sense. Amy, I want to come back to you, and I'll ask Ashu you the same question. But both of you left Google, which was was doing extraordinarily well when you both left, and you both started companies. And you go from having all the infrastructure and resources of a large company to starting one of your own. What was the hardest thing about starting a company after leaving Google?
Well, the scariest thing was leaving Google, right? And Ashu, you know how this feels. It's a very comfortable cocoon-like nest, right? Everything's taken care of, even your haircuts and your dental work, everything. It's like found right there. You never have to leave. It's utopia that you never have to leave, and they kind of coddle you and spoil you. And I remember I actually debated leaving for 5 months before I really got up the gumption to go. And it was only when a mutual friend of Ashu's and mine named Matthias Rule, who was my dearest friend at Google, and we co-founded a company together. Like it was only, after 5 months of talking about it that we finally left. And I remember waking up in a cold sweat. I don't know if other founders have had this, but I was like, oh my God, is this irresponsible to leave this much money on the table? Am I crazy? Some people give their right hand to have this position, and I'm just going to throw it away. And I think the 20th time I woke my husband up at 3 a.m. with this thinking, he was like, oh my God, you've already decided we're never going to go hungry. Just go in, resign, you'll be fine. Just do it, right? So that is how it all started. But the hardest thing was going from having everything taken care of, including recruiting, including all of these infrastructural services, which you don't think of, to, oh my God, we don't even have machines. We don't even have a bank account. We don't, there's no janitor for this office. That would be me.
You're the janitor, yeah.
I'm the janitor.
Yeah,
I'm taking out the trash. So that, really rolling up your sleeves and getting your hands dirty again, and getting back into that motion of, oh wait, is somebody going to take care of that? Oh no, okay, that would be me that needs to take care of that. Just remembering that was a new motion. Yeah.
What about you, Ashu? What was the hardest part for you?
Of course, right? Amy mentioned a number of things, right? Access to resources, people supporting you, all the infrastructure around you. That's definitely the case. I would say for me, there were 2-3 things which were some realization, some hard. The first one was, suddenly you are nobody. You no longer have Google's name behind you. No longer some of the people would respond to your calls immediately, instantly. When you were at Google, they no longer will do that. You have to always sell yourself. And I think that was one thing. So what Amy was talking about, enterprise sales, right? It is a different beast. And now you have to go and say that, just trust me, I'll make it happen for you. Yeah. I'm there for you, no matter now whether you're talking to the CEO on the other side or some very junior person and everything in between, right? I think that was one very interesting realization. And second is, this is kind of what I say as an entrepreneur, right? You are constantly balancing paranoia with optimism. And over time, learning that on every good day, you have to keep that paranoia over there, saying that what can go wrong? Today's a good day, but things can go wrong. And on a bad day, you're constantly looking for hope. And in both these two journeys, you are alone all by yourself. There is no one to support you in some sense, right? You can't talk about it to your family because your family is, you've been out all day, not just be here, don't talk about work. In office, you can't talk about it. So those were some of the things which were hard. You learn, adopt, adjust, and move on.
Well, and to your point, Ashu, having a co-founder is such a precious thing. So I was lucky enough to co-found with my best friend, and my husband actually ended up being our CFO. And so those two people and getting to do it together was phenomenal, because as obsessive as you are about your company, if your spouse and your dear friend are as obsessive, it makes it so much easier to live your life.
But having your spouse at work and at home, I mean, that is a unique experience. I mean, very few founders go through that.
That's a bold experience.
He's a lot easier to be with than I am, so I think it was easier on me than on him.
Well, yeah, I was going to follow up on that actually, because you spent 5 years leading a company. You raised multiple rounds of venture capital before you sold it to Cisco. What were some of the lessons you learned from that journey?
So, one of the biggest lessons was you're raising long before you actually raise, right? So the best way to raise is by when there's no pressure on the relationship, getting to know the person in advance. So, the second you're thinking, yeah, I might want to start something, it's already kind of, depending on the relationships you have in place, you may already know who you want to raise from. You may already know who your future board member is. And ideally, you start that years ahead so that you watch longitudinally this person as they're in different situations. Like you hear from your network and your friends who are founders, oh, okay, well, this person's kind of an asshole, or this person was phenomenal on these three things. And you start to accrue that intelligence, if you will. And it's so much better if you start that without pressure. If you have to start it with pressure, you do, and that's fine, right? You can get to know people pretty quickly in different ways. But I will say longitudinally, that's the best way. And to just do your homework. So once you got those term sheets, take that weekend or take that 48 hours and talk to entrepreneurs who failed with this investor, not who succeeded, because everybody loves each other when the numbers are good, right? Everyone's got so much love. But when the numbers suck and things are hard, what did that investor look like then? Did they just abandon ship and hightail it out of there? Were they, actually helpful? Did they actually kind of try and stick around? So those are the questions that you want to ask once you, have a good idea of who you want to go with. So that was one thing. The other was, depending on how much leverage you have, how you structure those deals, whether you give away a board seat or not. I mean, we raised a seed, an A and a B. We did $5.5 million in the seed. We did 20 million and then 20 million again in A and B. We only gave away one board seat. But we had the leverage across 3 rounds. We only gave away one board seat. We gave away 2 observer seats, but only 1 board seat. So the 2 co-founders had the 2 board seats, and then there was 1 independent. And that it just kept governance very clean. But depending on how much leverage you have, you may not know kind of what you can and can't do. So talking to other entrepreneurs about what's possible and what's not is a really useful thing. Or pulling in advisors. So we had a really strong advisory network. Lori Norrington, Godfrey Sullivan, John Hennessy, people who just had seen and could pattern match across tens or hundreds of deals, who I could just go to and say, okay, well, I'm trying to find a chief revenue officer, and I'm thinking equity this, cash this, but this person has come back and said to me, no, I want this other thing instead. Is that in norm, or is that outside of norm? And you can get some of that from your investors because they all participate in that comp survey. But I really want to know, for this particular talent that I'm looking at, what do you guys think in your calibration, right, as advisors? So that was a good way to leverage that network.
In fact, we were having a panel earlier in the day, and this was the topic of conversation as well. And I think the 2 things that came out was, one, in some ways, you may have a co-founder that departs, but you can never get an investor off your cap table. So put the same amount of energy on choosing investors as you do in co-founders. And the other was this point that, you want to start thinking about the next round the moment you close the prior round.
You're always fundraising.
Yeah, because you never know.
You're always.
And I tell my, and Ashu's heard this, that literally when you close the round, you start thinking about what's the deck for the next round going to look like. Not so much the details of the slides, but what's the story you want to tell 12, 18 months from now. You have to work backwards on what you need to do to get there.
Yeah.
Ashu,
I want to celebrate a little, though. Like, people forget to celebrate even a day.
That's true. I know Ashu raised a round recently. I'm going to come to him on that, and we haven't celebrated yet. So Ashu, you having done this at BloomReach, and you raised a fairly large chunk of change at BloomReach, what were some of the lessons you learned from that experience that you've been able to apply to Eightfold?
So at BloomReach, I was a CTO, slightly different role. So happy to talk about my financing.
Yeah, and there've been a bunch of audience questions about that already, so I'll definitely come to that.
I think so. I was there for roughly 7 and 8 years, right? And there are a few big learnings, I would say. One is thinking about the product. That is an echo coming.
No, I think we can hear you.
Hello?
We can hear you.
Can you mute by any chance, Ashu or Amy, for a second?
No, we can hear you.
Okay. So perfect. So very first thing is on the product, right? And how do you take a platform approach versus a point solution approach? I think that was a very big learning for us. If you're taking a point solution approach, you can sell very quickly, but on the other hand, you can be displaced very quickly. So every positive has their negative. So I think that's one fundamental difference. So we were always an add-on. How do you become mission critical over there? Second thing was about people. Are you trying to problem solve through people or by yourself? My default instinct was, let me jump in and solve every problem that is out there by myself. And over years, what I realized is that I can never ever scale that way. I have to solve everything through people by empowering them. Third is the market. Pretty much everything you can change, you can't easily change your market. And if the market you are in is a dying market, it won't work out. If the market that you are in is a small market, it won't work out. I mean, people have made it happen.
Yep.
But it's an uphill battle over there. And fourth, an interesting one that I like to highlight in general is that we are constantly thinking about what is valuable today in the market. We are not thinking about where the world will be in 10 years from now. Because in the first year, you will have zero revenue, most likely. In the second year, if you're doing well, you will have $1 million revenue. In the third year, you will have $3 or $4 million revenue. Fourth year, you will have 7, 8, 10, $12 million revenue, right? Any market is large enough for those numbers, pretty much.
Is the market large enough to be a big company?
10 years from now, you need to have 200, 400, $500 million of revenue. And will your market be there at that time or not? Will your product be relevant at that time or not, right? I think those are some of the key learnings that shaped how we have thought about product, technology, people, market, go-to-market at 8-Fold.
Got it. That's super helpful, Ashu. I want to come back to the comment you made that you were the CTO at BloomReach, and obviously, co-founder and CTO, and then at 8-Fold, you made the transition to founding the company and being CEO. There's a bunch of people in the audience that are curious, and what was that transition like, and what are some of the lessons to be learned there?
Absolutely. I think one of the things is that as a CTO, at times you are not in front of customers enough, and you're not selling enough. You're typically going in as someone to talk in the meeting, to explain certain things, right? But not really closing. And it was a big learning for me as I moved into CEO role. Sales become one of my top jobs. And how do you adjust to that? Second thing is that you have to think about marketing now and building the team and culture. That became a huge focus for me versus just thinking about technology and product on a day-to-day basis. So those were the big changes, I would say. But one thing I would say, which is actually in Bay Area, there are numerous tech founders and there are numerous people who are non-tech founders. And I'm putting product, engineering, everything under tech umbrella. And what I realized is the beauty of a tech founder is that your problem-solving instincts are very strong and you like to solve things through product and technology. Versus, for example, right, if you think about adoption, right, do you solve it through product? Do you solve it through technology, or do you solve it through training and selling?
Got it. Yeah.
And that's a fundamental difference that I have approached it, right? And that has helped us a lot.
And those little decisions in the early days can lead to very different companies as the arc of the curve evolves over a decade or so. Amy, you were going to say something,
right? Sorry, go ahead.
Amy was about to say something, I think, just to build on what Ashu was saying.
Oh, I completely agree that the lens with which you approach the problem very much determines how the entire company is going to approach the problem in a more and more kind of expansive way every single step of growth. Yep.
Amy, tell us more about sort of your journey, from a product and engineering standpoint. You had a lot of strengths, having come out of Google. On the sales and marketing side, as you sort of alluded to, it's a whole new ballgame when you're a startup. What were some of the lessons you learned? Any anecdotes of what, when you look back and at the experience, things you laugh about?
Well, so I was reflecting on the last 20 years the other day, right? So I was double A as well in school. So at Stanford, I did my bachelor's and my master's in electrical engineering. And then weirdly, I went to McKinsey right after that, and then eBay, and then Google, and then did my own, and then went to Cisco. But the kind of strange thing is I've done consumer and I've done enterprise. I've done a technically driven company like Google, but I've also done a very sales and marketing driven kind of heavy company like Procter & Gamble, like Cisco, et cetera, right? And juxtaposing, when you're always a stranger in a strange land, when you're working across consumer and enterprise, when you're working across technical and sales driven, when you're working across tiny, where you're taking out the garbage, and a 75,000 person company, being a stranger in a strange land all the time means that you're looking at everything kind of from an outsider's perspective all the time, which lets you observe both what is strange and unusual about that environment, but also what should not be. And so instead of accepting things, it's like when you visit a foreign country, it makes you question, oh, well, that's not how we do things in the US, but is how we do things the right way to be doing them. And so applying all of those learnings across those different realms has actually been massively helpful. And there's a lot of consumerization of enterprise that's happening on the product side. But in terms of go-to-market and all of the things that it takes to actually sell something, if you as a CEO have not sold, or as a founder have never had that experience yourself of having to, for example, bear hug the procurement people or do something that your salespeople do, I would suggest going to do it for a week, because it will give you such a deep understanding of the process that your company's going to need to go through, but it also give you a deep understanding of what your salespeople have to go through, and you'll hire better as a result. So having that kind of cross-pollination knowledge is critical. And I look at different companies and the different CEOs that end up leading the entire company and their internal bent, and you can see that echo through the entire leadership team and then through the entire larger team. The smallest things that you take for granted are going to echo in a massively amplified way through the entire organization.
Yep, that makes a ton of sense. And as you've gone through that experience, and now you've been on many boards yourself, both very large public company boards, like Procter & Gamble and Cisco, and very large tech companies like Splunk and Informatica. What are some of your observations as a board member? What makes for a great board member?
So I would distill it down to a few things. Number one, you don't want an airtime hog. So no matter how smart this person, if they are going to sit there and just talk because they like hearing their own voice, avoid, because they will screw up the entire dynamic of the boardroom. And they'll just make it difficult for that board to be a cohesive entity and to actually work together on things. So it may sound obvious, but it's hard to tell who's going to be an airtime hog unless you go and do your diligence for other boards that they're already on. And you actually ask the question, when this person opens their mouth, do useful things come out, or are they, someone who likes to kind of hog that, right? So that's one. I actually think that the best board members are genuinely curious. Like, they are people that are coming at being on your board from the standpoint of, okay, let me put on your shoes. Let me think about all the extrinsics that surround you, all of the macro effects that surround you and are pressing in on you. And let me bring for your benefit the summation of my experience and try and help you. But let me be curious about what's different about the company that you're working on together. Let me think about differences in style that you have with me, so that when I help you, I'm applying it on your behalf instead of on top of you or at you. Does that make sense? So I think people who can do that as board members are a lot more helpful, because then you're not always having to filter whatever they say through a lens of, well, is that me? Like, as a CEO, does that make sense for me? Is that how I like to lead? Like, you want someone who can actually help you do that. And then the third piece is, as you think about filling out a board, right, you're thinking about the different skill sets that you want people to bring, because you don't need 2 or 3 of the same person. If you have some investors with a lot of operating experience and others who are just phenomenally successful investors in a particular space or vertical, so that they can see across tens of companies, right, in that vertical. Those are two different uses. One person you may use to see around corners and to understand macro trends, and the other may be a phenomenal operator who can help you build out a great go-to-market team, right? Because if that's not your forte, then you're going to need somebody who can help do the interviews with you, be the last check, figure out how to set up sales comp, all those things that you may or may not know how to do. So thinking about strategically who you want to fill in those seats is great. And you don't have to bring them all onto your board. You can have an advisory board. You can pull in kind of talent that way. They don't all have to be on your board.
Well, Ashu, just like Amy, you in every round had the privilege of having multiple choices of investors and board members, and you've dealt with that in two companies now. So maybe you can share your perspective on what do you look for in a board member and what makes for a great board member?
I mean, Amy has a lot more experience on that, but I'll just share what I have seen over the last few years, right? First is, don't think of board member as an independent, but you're thinking of the whole board as a cohesive entity. So how different board members are going to contribute to the board. So you think of that holistic composition, right? So for example, in our case, right, we have Ashu, and at some level, right, outside being a financial investor, he also is consultant from his past life, and there's a value that he brings from that side. Peter, who's another board member, is an early stage investor, but product marketing person by training, and he brings a very different lens. Then Jules, who's a board observer, has a growth mindset. He comes from a late stage companies, and he brings the rigor of metrics to the board meeting. And we have a new board member, Quentin, who is an operator working with large enterprises, so brings that experience. So I think that's one part I would say. The second part is more than the board. Frankly, most of the board members in Bay Area are extremely smart people. They have a lot of experience, they've seen a lot. So it's less about board members, but how are you even managing the board? No board member wants to be surprised. If they are going to talk to you only once a quarter, they will have questions which won't make sense. If they don't have enough background about your company, it won't make sense. So it is up to the CEO, right? First, as a CEO, what I realized is that take the ownership and accountability. And ultimately, you are running the company and you have to make it successful. And everyone out there is there to help you succeed, but ultimately it is your job, make it happen, right? And what it goes to say that, think about board member, not just in the board meeting, but outside the board meeting. Will they have time?
It's a relationship. Yeah, it's a relationship.
Can you pick up the phone and call them? And if you're not talking to them at least every other week, if you're not able to discuss things with them, then they're not the right board member for you. It is a relationship of fear and trust. If you're afraid of talking to them, it's not a good board member for you. If they won't be your peer, they won't be able to discuss with you, they won't be able to empathize with you, they're not a good board member for you, right? So really think, can you have that strong relationship with them? Not just in the boardroom, but outside the boardroom. And are they going to add to the board or not?
So, every investor talks about, and I'll include myself in that bucket. So I'm not going to, we all talk about how we're going to add value to companies. And at the same time, every founder is afraid about, will this board member in some ways hurt my company? I mean, that's sort of the dynamic, especially on the early stage side, less so on the public side where, investors, most of the board members in a public company are independents, but you have in early stage companies, investors who are wearing multiple hats. Do you have, Amy, any examples from your history without necessarily sharing people's names of investors that added on one hand, extreme value upside or situations where you felt like, investors destroyed value?
So yes to both. And it very much depends. So thinking, don't forget to include yourself as the founder and any of your co-founders who are on the board as part of that organic composition of the board, right? And part of that kind of shape of the board, because you'll want people who complement and bring skill sets that you don't have. And redundancy with what you do bring isn't particularly helpful. I actually would answer that question more for independent board members, if you don't mind, because
Sure.
From that standpoint, I feel like I'm more able to speak to it. One of the things that I like to do with founders when I'm helping them think through a board, or when I'm thinking about joining it, is I say, okay, I want you to outline your 3 hairiest problems that you are wrestling with right now. Like the 3 things that keep you up at night, the things where you don't have answers yet, the things that are bothering you and sitting on you, right? And this is for independent board members. I don't know that I'd give this level of transparency when you're in the midst of a negotiation for fundraising, but for the independents. And they're under NDA. And then you as the founder need to outline kind of what your thinking is right now, and written is best. And then spend 2 hours together, really, really diving into those problems, ideating on how to solve them, figuring out who this person can bring in terms of their network to help solve some of these issues. Like let's just say someone is having to prep GC and CFO for going public in 2 years. And they're trying to say, okay, well, what does the CFO need to look like? What do they need to bring to the table? What kind of GC do I need? How do I even begin interviewing for this? The thing that this person can do for you is say, okay, well, let me introduce you to 3 best-in-class CFOs who've taken companies through this journey before. They may not be available, but let's get you pattern matched on what excellence looks like, so that you can know what it feels like, looks like, smells like, right? But the person that you're thinking about, that 2-hour session, you should leave with far more energy than you came in with. You should want to do that repeatedly with that person. And if the dynamics are right, you actually will have solved at least one of the problems to some extent, where you can, continue to zig and zag and move, right? Where you're not stuck anymore. But that 2 hours together will be so reflective of what your interaction is going to be like for 5 years, 7 years, 9 years, however long it is, right? So I would say just kick the tires in that way when you're thinking about it.
That's a great tool. Ashu, any stories from your side?
Over a scotch, not otherwise.
He has the best investors, Ashu. He loves them.
I think sometimes investors or board members don't ask tough questions. And I think that as much driving you in the wrong direction can hurt, equally important is asking the tough questions, and forcing you to think about that is equally important, I would say.
I think that makes sense. And it requires a certain level of trust that has been built up over time. And both of you talked about that, where the tough questions don't feel personal. And the dynamic in the room is such where you're all problem solving the question at hand versus it's a finger pointing exercise. Because otherwise, very quickly, board meetings can degenerate into that.
And I think one thing that Ashu said earlier is important as well, which is basically that relationship outside the boardroom. So that takes investment, right? That doesn't just naturally happen. You as CEO and founder are setting the tone. So asking your board member for that time, that's your job. So, and setting it up so that you give them enough information to be useful to you, that's also your job. And kind of having that be a discussion in board meetings, but making sure you're following up on the things that each person could be helpful to you on outside of board meetings. Those are all, pieces that are in your hands.
Makes sense. Amy, one of the questions that's been coming up as we're having audience questions is, in your role as sort of a board member at Procter & Gamble, you have a very unique vantage point into sort of the digital transformation that is underway across corporate America. And, and given your vantage point as a technologist and having founded technology companies so many times, I'm sure you can't help but sit in those rooms and ask yourself, I should go start X company or Y company or Z company to solve this problem. So what companies would you go start based on what you're seeing? Well, or what problems should you go solve, more importantly?
It's funny because, I will just say the great thing about some of the circumstances COVID has created, and so many are so terrible in terms of the consequences and circumstances. But one of the good ones is even technology laggards, right? People who just did not want to adopt video, did not want to adopt any of these productivity tools. They've had to out of necessity. So I feel like COVID has pushed us 5 years into the future in terms of getting those 2 standard deviations out, kind of laggard style users into the middle. And the beauty of that is now we have this base that we can all build from. I mean, I look at the weaknesses that COVID kind of exposed in supply chain, right? And in how much redundancy and resiliency there is in the supply chain. And I think massive investment is going to need to happen there by almost every company that makes physical goods, because it is just not in the place it needs to be today. And so I think we're going to see a huge wave of investment there. So I actually have a thesis around supply chain, and I'm helping some companies there because I think that's going to be huge. The other piece to digital transformation is just the adoption of technologies that already exist, but finally people are willing to start doing that. So for Procter & Gamble, we went through the largest activist battle ever known to mankind 3 years ago, right? Nelson Peltz came and he bought $3.5 billion worth of stock, and we had an activist proxy battle. But the great news is the company, which was already on a transformation path, accelerated that path. We've increased market cap by 140 billion in that 3-year period. Yeah. So we've generated $140 billion worth of stakeholder value in that period, but they completely switched from a functional model where every function had kind of a horizontal stripe into a business unit model where we have 6 business unit CEOs, sector CEOs now, and there's so much better accountability and there's so much more leanness to it. But the transformation that I've watched happen is an openness to experimentation. And that openness to experimentation means also openness to new tooling and new software, openness to new ways of doing things. But I feel like watching this 187-year-old company go through this massive transformation, every company is going to go through this sooner or later that's older than 30 years, right? It has to happen. And that for all of us startups that are selling into those companies, being able to tell that story so that the stakeholder that you're targeting can then do the internal marketing that they need to do, that is super critical. So I'll give you an example. For a security company, prepping the CISO to prep the board on why they need to buy your stuff, right? Having the CISO have a talk track that they can just basically slide out and give the board on why this is so essential helps them get your software funded at their company. And so thinking through 2 steps downstream of how do I help this person who's the decision maker get funding for my stuff, right? And thinking through what macro trends can I capitalize on? Is it ESG and CSR, right? Is it supply chain and COVID? Like, what are the macro circumstances that allow me to get my stuff funded by this woman who is sitting in the seat making a decision? That's something where I feel like I see a lot of startups still not go to that level of thought around, okay, well, how do I help them help me?
No, I think you said it very well. You know, I tell companies that are in the early stage all the time, don't think about selling software. You have to sell a promotion to your customer. Mm-hmm. Your customer has to feel like this is a way for them to move forward in their career, and they have to pitch that, you know, up the entire chain. And actually, you've done a lot of that at Eightfold. I mean, you have some of the largest companies on the planet as customers, and a lot of non-tech companies. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the same topic. How do you sell to large companies, and especially how do you do that in the era of COVID?
So in the era of COVID, it's tough. It's very painful, right? Because especially when you're selling to large enterprises, one big part is the trust. When you're talking about large deal, and you can never meet someone face to face, right? So it is challenging. And I'm still learning. I think there are more things, a lot more things that I don't know than I know. But what I've seen is it is a process. It won't happen. You have to go in with the right expectation. It will take 10 meetings. It will take 5 to 7 months to make that happen. What you are doing is you have to really understand the organization, understand their pain point, sell them a vision. They need to be excited, not just to use the product, to partner with you. And many of these large organizations, one thing they're looking for now is to transform themselves, and they need help. So the best deals that we have had, the best customers we have had, they champion us more than we championing our own product. So what you have to do is think of their pain point, their problems, their use cases. That's one big part. Mm-hmm. Second is also try to put yourself in their shoes to understand how they are going to roll out your product. Quite a few times, it's not really about whether they're excited about your product and technology or not, What they are worried about, things we take for granted outside, security that comes with the product or the risk that comes with it, right? Privacy risks, integrations, change management, training, rollout, reporting, all that stuff, right? And to Amy's point, right? How are they even going to get the budget for this approved? Who is the budget authority? What kind of a business case they're going to make? How are they going to show the value, not just this year, but the next year, right? You have to think through all that stuff. And quite a few times in the early days, we're not thinking of partners. I think partners can help a lot, especially in the large enterprises.
Yep.
So how are you building a relationship with that, network with them? So you have to think about all that stuff.
And everything gets.
Go
ahead, Ashu.
No, go on.
I was just going to add to Ashu's points where everything gets accelerated from that 5 to 7 month time frame to half that, or even shorter, if you can go in with a two-pronged approach. In other words, have somebody airdrop you right into the top, so that at the very highest levels, there's massive buy-in and a feeling of, oh, why haven't we done this yet? And you've sold enough of those high-level budget holders and decision makers to where there's a pull, right? And then coming into whoever the practitioner is and making certain that you're meeting their pain and they understand how you are going to benefit them in the way Ashu just, kind of outlined, and how you're going to help them get their promo, right? Like you just outlined. Coming in with that dual approach, you can get it done way, way faster. And that kind of airdropping in, leveraging your network, your board's network, your advisors' networks, just getting in there to get to a change agent at the most senior levels is super helpful to do that surround.
Absolutely, I think that's a good point. Yeah.
I think it makes a ton of sense. And I think, as you said, it's you really do have to leverage the entire network, because no CEO or no individual board member is going to know everyone that you might want to target. But it's surprising, if you can leverage a network of a dozen folks, how far you can get. Yeah. We're starting to come up on the hour, and I had a question for both of you before we wrap up. So Ashu, maybe I'll start with you, and then I'll come to Amy, to you. Over the last 40 years and change, I mean, you've seen a tremendous amount of growth at Eightfold. You've raised a very large amount of money. Just recently closed a round, and are a unicorn now. So tell us a little bit about, what does it feel like, and what advice do you have to founders who are starting off, especially technical founders who are looking to see the same kind of scale in their businesses from a go-to-market standpoint?
I think first is, I think I'm more nervous than anything else. With more money comes more pressure, more expectations, both inside and outside, right? But we have been fortunate, and there are a few things that have worked well. I think you have to be constantly listening, adopting, learning. You have to commit to a certain idea, but at the same time be open to a change. And I'm saying both things which are contradictory, but that is just what you have to do, right? And as Amy was saying about this, going from the top, right? Suddenly it got me thinking, right, what I do. And one thing that has worked well for me, and partly it originally comes from my engineering background, but that I have learned is, when you're selling, you have to do multi-threadedly. You have to have multiple touch points, not just one touch point, right? But an equally important thing is, even as I'm learning as a CEO, is have multi-threading going on with respect to your own questioning. Outside engineering, there are very few things where you have a crisp answer. So quite a few times you will see me asking the same question to 5 different people in the company in 5 different ways. And I'm basically trying to understand what is going on. And that's the only way I'm able to get the answer that I'm comfortable with or I learned, right? The same thing you have to do it with the customers. Same thing you have to do it with the market, right? Constantly learn, adopt, adjust. And other thing that you mentioned about the funding in the early, and there was this question, and quite a few times people ask a question about your multiple term sheets, which one you pick, right? And I mean, there's a lot of wisdom around that out there, so I'm not going to comment on that. But one thing I will comment on is equally pay attention to who you're not saying no to. Because in my case, pretty much every round, I've said no to one investor who has become my lead investor in the next round. So just don't say no. Make sure when you're saying no, you're building a relationship and in fact, getting them excited for the next round.
Hey, Ashu, I thought the simple answer to that question was just take the other Ashu's term sheet.
That was in Series B.
Amy, sort of wrapping up with you, after selling a company to Cisco, you took the lead for a 6,000 person team. I mean, that's real scale.
There's a lot of human beings.
What did you have to change in your leadership style to accommodate that kind of scale and that size of team?
Oh, it's funny because at Google, I had grown the team from very tiny. I mean, we were 4 core engineers and myself as the only product person when we started integrating Urchin to become Google Analytics. And then we grew it huge, right? And then we went and started from 0 for a company. And then all of a sudden there were these 6,000 human beings who were kind of given over into my care. And I felt the responsibility of them very deeply, and it would like press on me while I was trying to sleep at night. I had so much to unlearn, Ashu. I didn't even know how much I had to unlearn. Here's the thing that you kind of realize. We're all fancy monkeys, basically. And the larger the monkey troop, the more hierarchical and the more kind of bureaucracy comes into play. And that hierarchy matters in this way. So I would find myself saying something for literally the 10th time. And I hate repeating myself. I hate it. And I would be sick of hearing myself say it. And yet half my team had not heard it yet. And so just the sheer volume of times you have to repeat things, every order of magnitude your team grows. Expect your communications burden to also increase by an order of magnitude, right? That's kind of the way it is, just because there's so many people who need to hear, and people don't absorb it the first time you say it to them. Around the 3rd or 4th time, they really start to hear it and absorb it and adapt to it. But it takes repetition. And so you can't change on a dime your messaging either, unless some huge kind of external factor has come and crashed in and you have to, right? But you can't just switch your strategy kind of communication quarter over quarter because some 10-degree thing changed. The organization can't move that quickly and can't absorb and understand that quickly. So that was a big learning, right? The other thing that was so interesting to me, the luxury that you have right now as a founder, especially if you're earlier stage, is you can just ideate with your team. It's casual enough, it's informal enough to where, you can just sit down as a team and have an idea and talk about it, and that's totally okay. I forgot when I first started at Cisco, I had an ideation session with an individual product team because I love products, so I wanted to engage with them. And I said 4 or 5 things. And then 5 weeks later, they're like, oh, we're ready to present to you our, the projects that we spun up as a result of our meeting with you. And I was like, what?
Oh my God, I didn't, that's not what I meant. Yeah.
That's not what I meant for you to do at all. I did not mean to waste 50 people's time for an entire month on these like 4 ideas I had, which were just ideas. I hadn't even pressure tested them at all. And I was mortified that I had made these people do all this work, right? That's a lot of human hours of work that are potentially wasted. It turned out okay, because it turned out that they found 2 things that actually should be done. But my point is, you can't just be informal and just say things anymore. At some point, Ben Horowitz and I were talking about this years ago. At some point in any company's kind of trajectory, you hit a point, and usually it's around 100 to 150 people, where you have to start to formalize things. And you can't just depend on verbally saying them anymore. You have to start writing them down and distributing them and putting them in a place of record. Because as things change, people will feel out of the loop, and it's hugely demotivating for them. So that unlearning that practice that had been a 5-year kind of practice was very eye-opening.
That's and very helpful, Amy. That's, the constantly retraining your communication and then learning that it's a little bit like a pendulum. As you get to the higher up you are in these large organizations, a minor comment can create a lot of reverberation at the bottom, I think. Those are really important lessons. And thank you very much, Amy, for joining us today. And thank you, Ashu. It's fabulous having you at FC Build today. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashu. Thanks, Amy.